Thank you for inviting me here tonight. It's a great honor to be here. And Engelbert, I think that was the nicest introduction I've ever had, so thank you for that. So, that was really great. So, tonight I'm going to give you an overview of a series of papers. I realize it's the end of a very long, demanding day, so I'll try to be a little entertaining. We were told no equations, actually, because it's just too much after 5 o'clock. To give you an overview of where I'm going to head today, when I give a talk like this to sort of mixed audiences, I like to pause at the beginning and talk a little bit about feminism, and then about production, and then about reproduction. And the focus here is what happens, particularly for policy, when we can get economists to think about care work, particularly unpaid care work, as especially productive work. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the economic model that sort of started this whole line of work for me and others that I've collaborated with, including Daniele Tavani, who's here in the audience today. And it starts with a Baduri-Margolin model, and it's informed by Kaleckian principles. You'll see that hopefully as I talk through. And then we do an empirical application in a growth and framework using a sort of standard growth econometrics. So starting off with feminism. So a key motivating point of view here, what does it mean to be a feminist economist? A prior is that identity, particularly one's gender identity, substantially influences the production of knowledge, the kinds of questions that you ask, the choices that you make about theory. And one primary example of that perspective is the invisibility of care and non-market work in economic analysis. Now, you may have seen this example before. I think it's kind of an old one. But here, is this famous quote from The Wealth of Nations. It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from regard to their self-interest. Most critiques of that adage commonly focus on the centrality of self-interest and Smith's later work about social virtues like trust in the theory of moral sentiments. But for feminist macro, the key point is that butchers, brewers, and bakers weren't actually making Smith his dinner because they were just providing the raw materials for dinner. There's a lot of other work after you get the groceries, essentially, right, to get dinner on the table. In Smith's own life, presumably much of that labor, whether it was coordinating the labor of other people or doing that labor directly, was provided by his mother, Margaret Douglas, with whom Smith lived his whole life. He never married. She died at the age of 90, and he died 6 years later. So, I'm glad you found that humorous. So Smith was of the opinion that labor which did not result in a commodity was unproductive. And we live with that legacy today, and one manifestation of it is that work which occurs outside of the market is excluded in estimates of GDP. The system of national accounts now includes production for own use, like growing food or collecting water or fuel. Unpaid care work, though, is still requisitioned or encouraged in satellite accounts. Now, Marx had a similar view of household production and reproduction. Production for one's own use and production for exchange were excluded producing for other family members or producing for oneself. By contrast, many modern critics of capitalism, influenced by Engels' work, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, see the rise of private property in early class societies as preceding and giving rise to gender inequality. But in fact, patriarchy preceded and coexists with capitalism. You might think of young women as the first form of exploitable property and surplus, constituting the spoils of war and marauding that preceded property in land and livestock. Their reproductive capacities were an important asset where population gave you an advantage in competition. So patriarchal gender systems thus played an important role in the evolution of capitalism as we know it, giving rise to what Nancy Fulbright and others term patriarchal capitalism. And a central aspect of patriarchal capitalism is the organization of social reproduction, or as I'll define it, the time and commodities it takes to produce and reproduce the labor force. So the gendered and racialized, I might say, organization of social reproduction is thus key to modern capitalism's evolution, its success, and its vulnerability to crisis. So that's my little piece on feminism. Now, talking about production, why am I talking about economic growth, which will be a driving sort of concept in this discussion? Well, for me, a lot of my work is focused on development, and increases in per capita incomes or productivity is essential for sustained improvement in well-being. Growth is also an important concept that characterizes a lot of the different sustainable development goals. And, you know, this is something that was really driven home for me when I worked at UNCTAD, that economists and policymakers really care about economic growth. And so if we are not sitting at the table talking about social reproduction and care in a language in which others are interested in listening to you, we cede an important part of the policy discussion. So in a really central sense, this sort of work for me is political. So let me tell you a little bit about how I define reproduction. As I've said before, social reproduction entails the time and commodities, so commodities includes goods and services that cycle through the market to reproduce the labor force. Typically, economic growth models don't treat labor as produced or maintained to the extent that you do get, right? Human capital, for instance, it's all about formal education and work experience, all of the labor that it takes to get people to the schoolhouse door is abstracted from, or all of the labor that it takes in time to renew and restore ourselves every day after work is also abstracted from. And here I have borrowed an image, which is a woodcut from the cover of Nancy Fulbright's Who Pays for the Kids? Gender and the Structures of Constraint. And it illustrates this process, or an aspect of it, where you have the factory in the background and all of the people going into work to work on the assembly line at the factory. But at the end of the day, they return home to be restored so that they can wake up the next day and go back to the factory. So there are, from an economic policy perspective, there are important negative consequences to undervaluing or ignoring care work. I think in mainstream or neoclassical economics, children are essentially treated the same as pets, where people have them because they add to their utility and it sort of pleases them, right? And so any investment that they make in them is about, right, adding to their utility. And the larger social value of these kinds of investments are completely ignored. But in fact, children and caring for others can be thought of as manifestations of public goods, right? Where future teachers, neighbors, community members, employers, right, benefit from investments in children. And also ignoring this kind of work ignores market or casts market efficiencies, for instance, in austerity programs, as simply because it's being generated by a transfer of work from the market sector to the non-market sector. So say cuts in healthcare spending that are compensated for by longer periods of time recovering at home is not in fact an increase in efficiency, but rather a transfer. And so models that do this presume unlimited supplies of caring labor. So again, a key question that motivates this perspective is, how does allowing for social reproduction change our analysis of various public policies or strategies for development? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the model. I'll start with a characterization of the theoretical macroeconomic model, where I'll develop different social reproduction regimes, then present some work about empirically estimating these regimes using principal component analysis, and finally closing with growth regression analysis. So some foundational concepts from the model. This is how social reproduction works in the model. It takes place in the household. Inputs into the production function are commodities and unpaid care time. Outputs are what we refer to as human capacities, which is just anything that makes individuals more economically effective. It's a concept that's a little more expansive than human capital because it includes things like emotional maturity or being well rested and well fed. But it's narrower than another term you may be familiar with, human capabilities, because we are capturing only those aspects which makes folks more economically effective. So I think a new sort of step that I would like to take with this work, and if any of you are interested in this work at all, I think which is really important to do, is to incorporate a perspective on old age and how do we, maybe depreciation is one way of thinking about it. I'm not completely satisfied with that, but we need to come up with something better, but having a whole life course, perspective on this. So there are two time horizons to production. There's the daily aspects of social reproduction in the model, the coming home every night from the factory and getting restored to show up the next day. But there are also long-term investments that raise future productive capacity. And also add to current aggregate demand. So you can think of an investment function that includes not only physical capital, but also investments in human beings. This approach is gendered in a couple of different ways. One is that there's gender segregation in labor markets. So in the model itself, women are segregated in the paid care sector, and men work in the sector that produces durable goods. But then also there's a gender division in the home. Although women and men both provide time and money into the cost of social reproduction, women provide more time than men do, and the amount of money that men and women contribute varies, as well as to the kinds of things that they purchase, but that's getting into too much technicality for today. So there's a demand side and a supply side, For the demand side determines the relations of economic growth, and a key driver here is the relationship between gender equality in the labor market and growth, and whether the relation is positive or negative depends on the impact on aggregate demand and profitability. I'm sure this is familiar with to this audience. So when I present this, I talk about two stylized types of economies which characterize the two poles. One is a care-led economy where the relationship between gender equality in the labor market as measured by wages and economic growth is positive, but an inequality-led economy, that relationship is negative. And the key characteristic that we focus on in this paper that differentiates these two types of economies is what we call caring spirits, which is intentionally parallel to Keynes' animal spirits. And so caring spirits refer to the tendency of societies, whether determined by social norms, individual motivation, or public preferences, as reflected in social welfare states, to provide care or support for care for oneself and others in ways that add to current aggregate demand as well as future productivity. So in care-led economies, caring spirits are strong. In inequality-led economies, they are weak. The model also has, the standard features of these models and the sort of variables that we focus on that also come into differentiating care-led versus inequality-led have to do with production orientation, right? A domestic production orientation tends to be more highly associated with care-led economies, for instance. And then there's also a different sort of macro policy stance, one that's more development and employment oriented versus just geared to managing openness. So then we looked for variables that we could use in a principal component analysis to represent these major features of this model. And so looking for variables for which you could get a time series on, right, because we're thinking about applying this to a growth analysis, and also variables that are available for many, many countries, right, because we're interested in particular in asking questions about development and social welfare, social reproduction regimes. And so how could we find something like that for caring spirits? This was, I think, the most challenging, but what we ended up using was using two of the components of the Human Development Index. So we looked at the change in education relative to income and the change in health relative to income. And so the idea is that countries which have larger positive achievements in education or health relative to their income growth are also likely to be countries that have stronger caring spirits. And countries in different income groups, right, have different space for achievements in those variables, so we also split up different groups of country by income levels, but that's too much detail for now. Production orientation, we use manufacturing exports as a share of GDP, and inward FDI as a share of investment. And then for macro policy stance, we use public investment as a share of GDP and weighted average tariff rates, both of them on the hypothesis that the higher they are relative to others in the sample, the more likely that their macro policy stance is oriented towards a developmental employment focused kind of development policy as opposed to just managing openness. So that's the demand side and growth. There's also a supply side, which is characterized by the distribution of social reproduction between women, men, the state, and capital. And there are three sectors on the supply side: the labor market, the household sector, and the product market. So the labor market is a standard sort of approach in these kinds of models, although there's gender segmentation in the labor market. As I noted before, women work in market care services, men in durable goods, and the level of unemployment is related to labor's bargaining power and their capability to bargain for better wages. Women, all else equal, have weaker bargaining power, less capability of translating employment or lower unemployment into higher wages, but that's a conversation for another time. So the household sector is where human capacities are produced, as I noted before, and that's what that figure refers to. Commodities and time are combined to reduce human capacities, and this generates two things. One is the demand for market care services, right? Because to the extent that there's substitution going on or increasing participation in the labor market, the household has to provide market substitutes for that. But it also generates the level of labor productivity on a daily basis. So labor productivity is endogenous, and that's the sort of daily renewal dynamics that I talked about at the beginning. Lastly, we have the product market, where wages from the labor market and labor productivity from the household sector combine with a system of flexible markup pricing to generate prices and profit shares. So then on this side, on the supply side and the distribution of social reproduction, we have two stylized types of economies, a high road and a low road. And these two are differentiated by the distribution of the time and financial costs of social reproduction. In a high road or more gender egalitarian economy, these costs are equitably distributed among women, men, and the state here serving as a mode of redistribution from capital. And then in the low road case, women bear most of the responsibilities themselves. And a key differentiator that we look at in terms of changing the model is the effects of increased female labor force participation on human capacities production. Because if you raise women's wages, they'll increase their labor force participation. What are the implications for productivity and human capacities production? So, like on the demand side, there are certain features of the model that we've identified as important for driving the differences between these two regimes. So one is unpaid care work. In the high road economy, there's a sharing between women and men. In the low road economy, there's low participation by men. Public provisioning for care is strong in the high road case and weak in the low road case. What sorts of market care substitutes are available? In the high road case, there are lots of choices and they're very high quality. In the low road case, there are either very few choices or those that exist are low quality. Gender inequality in the labor market is also important because, remember, women are concentrated in the care sector. And so if there's a large gender wage gap, wages for care sector workers are going to be low, and the quality of the care provisioning that they provide will also be lower, all else equal. And then lastly, we used reproductive infrastructure, which here we're talking about investments that make care provisioning, particularly in a developing country context, easier. So investments in sanitation, in water availability, in energy, in transportation. So on the supply side, we also identified variables to measure all of these important features and come up with a principal component for the supply side. The most challenging here is the gender division of care. We have an increasing availability of time use studies, but I mean, if you think about trying to get it over a significant time series for a wide array of countries, it's really impossible. We did find a proxy that was highly correlated with the data that we did have on the gender division of care, and that was the ratio of female to male age at first marriage. So I don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to hang out here on the PCA slide, but instead talk about putting the two sides together, the demand side and the supply side, and then we have 4 regimes of growth and social reproduction. A time squeeze regime, where we have care-led with low road. Higher wages for women are good for growth, but as they increase their labor market participation, it squeezes time and lowers human capacities production, so growth is elusive or unstable. The mutual win-win scenario, care-led with high road. Exploitation, where higher wages for women lower growth, and more market participation also squeezes time and lowers human capacities production, so growth is partly based on exploiting women's labor and human resources. And then lastly, wage squeeze, where higher wages for women, lower growth, but more market participation enhances human capacities production. So because of the contradictions between the two sides, growth is also elusive or unstable. So I'm going to leap forward, because I don't have a lot of time left, So here's what the PCA distribution looks like for developed economies for the period between 2008 and 2015. And so each quadrant, right, corresponds to one of the social reproduction regimes. Most countries are in the time squeeze quadrant, where higher wages for women are good for growth, but as they increase their labor market participation, it squeezes time. It's really interesting to see where different countries fall, in terms of these quadrants, and are they consistent with what you might expect? We don't have a lot of time. We don't have any time to do that, but I wanted to show you what this looks like. And I'm happy to share papers with you. So this is the global distribution of countries. We had 156 countries in the sample over, this is for 2008 to 2015, but we start in 1990. This is what time paths of social reproduction regimes look like for different developing areas, as well as the world at the top. Looking at the top left, the world is getting more gender egalitarian on the supply side, but more inequality-led on the demand side, which I think is in keeping what I might expect. Okay, I have 1 minute left, so I'm going to skip this. So then we put these PCA estimates into a standard growth regression analysis that included just 3 time periods, with per capita GDP and the stock of human capital at the beginning of the period, and average investment, and an index measuring the rule of law, as well as country and time fixed effects. With PCA estimates, the numbers don't really mean anything. So we had more confidence in the numbers that were further away from the axes that we imposed on the set. So we weighted a dummy that indicated each different regime by the supply time, the absolute value of the supply times the demand score. So the further away from the axis the observation was, the heavier the weight in the regression. And, in terms of the results, it's sort of along the lines that I would have anticipated. Exploitation and time squeeze are negatively associated with growth. The mutual regime is positive but weakly statistically significant. Looking at the wage squeeze, it was not significant in terms of economic growth, but it was strongly associated with higher volatility, which is what I might think. So in closing up and finishing, I want to reassert that I think including social reproduction and care as a source of current consumption, as well as future productivity growth, is essential to understanding how macroeconomic policy affects growth and development, and that the gender division of labor is central to that understanding. And also to drive home, that we should have expanded notions of investment and not just think about investment in physical capital. Some of the things we think of as consumption are actually investment. And another related question is, particularly thinking about development and ecological concerns, can human services generate the productivity growth necessary to raise living standards in the way that we think of industrialization and technological change as doing it? And lastly, I hope I've convinced you maybe a little bit that feminist perspectives can improve macro policy effectiveness. So thank you.